Hello and welcome to a simple solution to globalize your website. My name is Victor Ramirez, Director of E-Business Solutions at SYSTRAN, and I will be your mediator for this webinar. SYSTRAN has been a leader in machine translation for over 52 years. We provide the highest level of translation quality, facilitating multilingual collaboration and reducing translation costs. SYSTRAN machine translation makes internal and external communication seamless while improving global productivity and international business development. Before we jump in, should you have any questions during this webinar, please submit them using the Q&A button for us to collect. Toward the end of the presentation, we will respond to them directly. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Philip Steiger, Technical Account Manager at SYSTRAN, to lead the conversation on a simple solution to globalizing your website. Philip, you have the ball.
Hey, thank you, Victor. Can you hear me? Everybody okay? See, thank you and hello, welcome. Today we'll be talking about a couple of tools, but particularly focus on one tool called the translation widget. We'll see what it's for, how it works, at least the basics of it, and what's involved in configuring it, right? If you want to deploy that in your solutions, in your websites. What do you actually need to make it happen? And are there any sort of customizations, perhaps to control how it's translating? We'll probably have time for an example or two. And also we want to give some time for questions so we can help you understand what's next and how to proceed with that. So what is it for? What is the use case, right? We want to translate a website. Now you have a website and you want to have it presented in other languages, but with a minimal effort. That's perhaps the key element in this particular product or implementation. So you have basically a web page or multiple pages that are on a website. You want them translated on the fly. It's HTML code. You want to translate most of it, not all. Not everything needs to be translated. You have maybe some images that contain text, or you have maybe some keywords, specific sentences, legal stuff. Not everything needs to be translated. So we want to have some mechanisms to perhaps control what does and what doesn't get translated. You also don't want to mess with your own existing JavaScript to have some of the code change and formatting tags and other things. So it needs to be a little bit more intelligent than just translate everything. When and where is this happening? We want to try to make this efficient for your website, meaning not much load to your website, right? So minimal effort to make it happen, but also minimal load to your website. It's going to be basically a communication between the user, the visitor, and the translation server. One thing we don't want to do typically in this scenario is do it ourselves. Now that's not a solution we should totally ignore. Sometimes it is called for. Sometimes you do need to have parallel websites, the English version, the French version, and so on. You translate your content from the databases that make the content of the website. You have a French copy, a Dutch copy, an Italian, and so on. But you don't want to do that in this particular instance. You don't want to do this yourself. It's a hassle. There's a lot of, it's a project that can be pretty major. There's a lot of things you need to do, and it's time consuming and costly. What we're looking for really instead is a solution that could do something like this. You have a website, maybe it's a forum with multilingual content. You see, perhaps get some feedback of how much was translated, the ability to switch back and forth between the original and the translation. And in this particular case, this was a couple of years ago, we had some sentences in Chinese that get translated to English. There are some other sentences that are already in English. We may still want to have a tooltip that indicates, as we move with a cursor, what was the original language. So some capabilities perhaps to switch from one language to another. Here is one that's very active and very present. It's the NMT, the Open NMT product. It's a framework that we also use, that we actually co-develop and host and sponsor. And on that website, we'll see that as an example. There is translation available. So you can have the original in English, you can click it to see it in French or in Chinese. And some of the material will get translated, not all of it, right? And some of it you may want to control how it gets translated. So let's take a look at the technology, right? What is it that the end user typically wants? You're going to sit at the website, you're going to open a web browser, you're going to say, hey, there's a website, let's go see it. and the website material comes back, and then you'll say, wait, no comprendo, señor, I don't understand this language. So you want to present this actually, now that it's in the browser, you want to present it in a different language. So here's a SYSTRAN server, and it's a communication between the browser and the SYSTRAN translation server. It's not your website that's going to have to worry about translating it, right? So it's coming from the browser. Communication is with the SYSTRAN translation service, and then we have happy visitors. So here's a little bit more detailed. The visitor comes in with a PC, a Mac, a browser that's JavaScript enabled, modern day browsers. Even, you could be on an Xbox, you could be on a smartphone. There's a couple of places where you have that available. And the visitor goes to a website, and in addition to the reference page from that website, you simply need to also have one line of code that says, oh, here's some JavaScript that will do the magic. Right? So it comes back with the page and the JavaScript, and that JavaScript then gets busy looking at, okay, what do we translate? That can be a fairly sophisticated system with multiple modules, multiple servers. It could be a one entry point, very simple. Some of that customizable with glossaries, dictionaries, and that sort of thing. So there are several readily available solutions for that. PNMT Cloud, SYSTRAN Translate Pro, but you can also have your own server, right? SPNS, SYSTRAN Pure Neural Server. And we call this website then at that point a widgeted website, right? Because it's carrying the widget that takes care of this translation. There might be even some extensions that you implement for crowdsourcing. It's something we've had in some implementations. It's something that's available on the server actually to reach by API. So there's a couple of ways to get feedback and then process that. Now, there's really a couple of different ways that we could approach that. Once the page is in the browser, the JavaScript kicks in. And one technique would be on the left side here is the brute force approach. You say, hey, send this entire thing to the server, translate everything. Well, or at least have it decide what to translate. And that's not really ideal because there are times where there are things you really don't want to touch at all. You don't want to translate it. You don't want to have it accidentally modified, even if it's already translated or something like that. You may also really don't like the traffic to have that much material go through when only some of it maybe needs to be translated. So the widget you see on the right side has much less traffic between the browser for the visitor and the translation server because it is actually an intelligent approach. It's looking for the content in that page. It's looking for things it can and should and might want to translate, and has a lot of different filters and mechanism by which it decides what actually needs to go. And then it sends it in a very efficient way. It sends multiple requests in parallel. So it's a multi-threaded approach, and you have a fairly responsive translation that can happen automatically. So there's two things you need for that, right? We saw earlier in the graph, there is a widget, basically some JavaScript that comes from your web server, from your website. And then there is a translation server that is consulted by the widget once it runs on the browser. So requirement number one is the widget, and it is tailor-made. It's something that we pre-configure. SYSTRAN will work with you to put it together based on what's the website you're working on, a couple of criteria like what languages you need. Do you have your own buttons? You might want to add some extra code to allow users to switch language directly. And then, of course, the requirement number two is the translation server. That could be a service readily available, like PNMT Cloud, the SYSTRAN Translate Pro in the cloud, or it could be something that you host. The SPNS, SYSTRAN Pure Neural Server, is typically something you can host on your behind the firewall on-premise. And have much, even more control in terms of how you customize it or what else you use it for, right? It may not necessarily be just for translating your website. There are also two different worlds to consider, right? The deployment, that website might be an internal wiki, a knowledge base. Your organization, that's the intranet versus the internet scenario, right? So the intranet, typically you have maybe a large organization that just has gone global, and now it's time to also go multilingual on your websites. You may have an acquisition, and suddenly you have some content in Japanese, maybe automotive repair guides, or medical stuff in French, in German, and so on. And you want to have that presented to your coworkers across the continents in their own respective languages. So there's a couple of ways to do that. And again, the big overriding criteria there, you're in a rush. You want to do this minimal time to market. For the internet, same thing. You have the ability to deploy present websites that way in translated forms. And of course, that may raise sometimes some questions about security. Is the API key secure? Does it really matter? There's a lot of things you can do to make it safe enough. And we can discuss a couple of those as needed. Configuration. Let's talk about the configuring the translation widget, right? What's involved? So it's something that we do based on some of the criteria and the parameters. And what I'll do here in 2-3 slides, I'll show you some of the parameters. We need to know what's the URL you're going to use for the translation server, right? So you may have a subscription with us, or you're about to get one, or you may have, like in this case, a 192.168. something. You have a local IP address from a server on premise. You may not even need the SSL to that if you're secure enough on that material. So that would be, for instance, an intranet scenario for the deployment, but it could be anything like you own subdomain or something like that. You'll need an API key. We'll put that in. We'll need to know what languages you want, and also perhaps what languages you want for language identification. There is a LID, language identification option, and you may know, for instance, a page has some feedback or forum content from different users, and they may be in Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and perhaps in French as well. So you can have a list of languages identified. That's at the source language also to identify what really should be looked for. The widget will go and look for stuff that it may want to actually translate. On the target side, you can have it fixed. You could say translate it to a specific language. So sometimes you have a server, a website that needs to be, that you write in English, but you want to present it for your Canadian customers in French or in Germany or in Italy, in different languages, in just that one site in that one language. Or you might let the user choose with some buttons or some other mechanisms. It might be automatically detected from the browser settings, some cookies, and so on. There's also exclusion of some user agents, like exclusion of older versions of IE or some browsers. So there's a couple of things like that. I'm not going to cover everything here, but some ideas on strategies for deployment, right? The prerequisites essentially is, as we saw, a widget file. That's the JavaScript file. And then you need to host that somewhere. And the recommendation really is that you put that on the web server itself, because especially if it is a secured site, if you have HTTPS on that site, if it is encrypted with SSL, you're going to want to do this in such a way that it doesn't raise security alerts on the browser for the web visitor. So you want the widget itself to also be on a secure site. And that's the natural choice, to have it come from your web server itself. It could potentially also be on the translation server, but only if you host it, right? If it's your SPNS server. So here are some other examples. The LID, the language identification, we saw earlier this Chinese forum. And so we can have the language identification, including detecting, like specifying what languages are candidates, what could potentially be found that should be translated, right? So it's going to analyze, since it's analyzing the web page content anyway, to see what is there that we should possibly translate. It's going to then also do language identification on those to see if it's actually, maybe it's already at the target language and it doesn't need any. There are other ways to prevent that translation if you want to, and we'll see one or two of those. Let's talk about the scenarios. There are easily two, maybe three main scenarios. One is you have code that you want to add to the website, so it appears automatically in a different language. And so there's a flag that's the auto start. You set that to true, and it will then take care of having it automatically translated. It may even take that from some browser settings. So there's a couple of options there. That's the really simple approach. We basically, you'll basically need to have that JavaScript added to the end of your page, right? Once the page is loaded, it will see that JavaScript. And typically, it's right before the /body tag, right near the end of the page. And you might have that just on the first page or on a specific page. Maybe only a few pages need to get translated. So you put that wherever it needs to be. The most natural thing is you put it in the footer. You have some sort of a footer at the end of the page, and you put the code in there that says, here's some JavaScript widget that will translate it, wherever you actually have it, wherever the path is, etc. Another scenario is where you actually want the users to choose what language it is. right, that they want to read. It comes initially in English perhaps, and they want to see it in French or in Chinese or some other languages. So that will mean you need to add a little bit of extra code, but it's quite minimal. To have it presented in a different language, all we do is we create a cookie, a document cookie that we call SYSTRAN target language, and we set it to the value that you want to see it, and then cause it to do a refresh. So here's, for those who are somewhat familiar with JavaScript, here's an example. In fact, this is straight from the OpenNMT website. You have basically a couple of lines like a div tag identifying actions with an on-click event, right? So when there is an on-click, when you click on that, and that thing is English text or Francais or Chinese, when you click on that, when there is an on-click event, simply what it does is it sets the cookie to the specific language that we want to see, and then cause a reload, refresh that page. Now, so you might actually see it in English before it comes into that, but it goes really quick, and sometimes it may not even notice. But that's basically the mechanism there. There are a few other ways, and this is what we call a bookmarklet, a bookmarked applet. So this is perhaps a solution if you're doing something you absolutely cannot modify the website. Let's say for an intranet deployment, and you have control over the browsers. These are your employees' computers, intranet. You can deploy something, or you can install a bookmark on there so that they can actually click it to see the translation. And there's a couple of other ways actually to do that. But no, that would be a simple approach if you have that particular scenario. Other ways to translate a web page, which actually uses similar code that we have developed also for the widget, is in fact the toolbar that you install on the browser. So if you have control over that, we can look at that, and we'll take a look at it in the demo, in the live demo. But before that, let's talk about customization also, right? Is there some customization capability? And that doesn't mean necessarily translation like quality or having the proper words chosen or something like that, but that's quite often that's what we understand it to be, or to be for. So there's actually two systems here, right? There is the JavaScript widget, and then there is a translation server. And logically, there is indeed two different places or types of customizations you can attack. You can create customizations at the translation server level, where you control with things like user dictionaries, glossaries, how certain words will be translated, translation memories for full sentences, and that sort of things. And then there is a customization number two, which is actually at the JavaScript code level. And there is one, again, a DNT, which normally means do not translate. But in this case, it's even a little bit stronger. It's really do not touch. It means that the JavaScript widget decides not even to send it to the translation server. So first example, at the translation server, we have user dictionaries, right? So the default system doesn't come with dictionaries. You are, however, able to add them to it, right? So you can create a list of terminologies that you want translated, but maybe translated differently from what it does. You know, acronyms even. Acronyms like UPS, it's not necessarily the parcel system. It could be uninterruptible power supply. And in German, that's not UPS as an acronym. That's USV, ununterbreechbare Stromversorgung. DNT, do not translate. You don't want certain names to be translated, like Mr. Friendly to turn into Senor Amistoso or something like that. We typically don't, but occasionally there might be a scenario where that happens, and you can override it, right? So you can actually impose, or in fact, it doesn't translate, and for some reason you do want it. Like, for instance, you might want Philip to turn into Felipe, or to anonymize it and put a couple of X's there. There's also perhaps glitches or typos in the web page that escaped the spell checker, or that escaped the scrutiny of your reviewers. And especially when we have PDF content that got scanned and then presented, you might see avion, the airplane, that looks a lot like a number 6, the O with the accent, if it is a low quality, high compression JPEG scanned image that got OCR'd and that sort of things. So we can turn that back into an airplane during the translation. Here's an example of some of the customizations. This is actually from a knowledge base or a user guide that we have for another one of our products. And I wanted to just show some examples. The original here in the top, you see find answers quickly. And in English, that's cool. But let's say in German, we wanted to have an exclamation mark there to make it really an order or something like that, or a request. And so you can do that. You can replace a sentence with another one. And it's basically called a translation memory that says, well, normally I know we would translate it fairly well, but we want to do something different. Something different also perhaps on this one, number 2, is to replace a word with a different one. And it might be simply a different capitalization. Right now, I'm showing this because it's possible, not necessarily that that's the proper thing to do. You might, however, want to, or even have spaces between the letters or something else like that. Perhaps the most significant example here, though, is to actually control certain terms that should not be translated. And this one here, you see multilingual and do not translate. These actually, pun intended, should not translate, because this is a user guide or a reference guide that describes what you need to name the tabs in a spreadsheet so that it recognizes when uploading it as a part that should not be translated. And so you can't afford to have that translated because we need to leave it as is. And so you can actually see it. Otherwise, you'd see multilingual turns into mehrsprachig, do not translate turns into nicht übersetzen, and you want to revert that and actually not see those translated. So those are the dictionary or translation memory capabilities you have at the server level. There is also customization at the widget, and it's not just about controlling or what to translate and what not. It might be some parameters that change. You may switch to a different API key, maybe for security reasons or for other reasons. You decide it's time to give it a different profile ID. You may have different languages or the same language but with extra resources, and you actually identify it with a profile ID. You might also switch to a different server, right? You might have initially a server, maybe the cloud-based, cloud-hosted solution by us, and you switch to something in-house. There's a couple of different ways to address that. But most importantly also, it's defining rules for DNT, for do not translate, right? So typically these are span tags or with a class. There's a class like class equal DNT, and that will allow you to tag a whole set of sentences that should not undergo translation. That could be a whole paragraph. And that's a scenario that you see when, for instance, you have actually hired some language service providers and they already pre-translated some material, especially for legally binding content, right? Contractual material or statements about you're going to win this much money or lose that much, stuff like that. You don't want to have it go wrong in machine translation. It may not go wrong, but you just don't want to take the risk. So you want to control certain areas not to undergo further changes. And it may also be because the material is perhaps in a different language and you don't want it to turn into English or whatever the target is. So there's a variety of reasons why you might want to keep it that way. And I have a couple of examples here. Let's go first to openNMT.net, which is this website here. So that's a framework that we use actually for our neural machine translations and build on top of that. And as I mentioned, we have here some code that allows you to see the page in a different language. And so here we go, shows it in French, shows it in Chinese, and you see it's displaying it in English quick before the refresh, and actually causes it to analyze again and to switch it back to the other language. And so the thing is not everything gets translated. Like here you see over the line, there are some words in English that stay in English. Well, that's because these are actually in an image, right? And that's typically the scenario, most of the time that's the scenario where you don't want to actually translate those because, for instance, it represents code, it represents something that stays in English, no matter what language you're teaching it in. But there are cases where you want actually to replace it with a different image. That's not the stuff you do with the JavaScript widget. That's something where you'd be better off actually using an implementation on your own, right? With pre-translating, and we can certainly help you pre-translate massive amounts of material into a parallel database. So you have all the sentences in the target language. And then you also decide at your application level, your web application, which image to show based on some clues as to what language is being displayed. But really, in terms of getting this out live and fast and with minimal impact on your web, there's very little development needed on your side. All you need to do is add a JavaScript call that we provide the script for. And then everything happens not through your web server. It gets served to the viewer, to the visitor. And from there, the communication is not going back to your page, to your server. It's going straight to our translation service. So that's one example. There's other ways I mentioned to translate. That would be, for instance, a toolbar. I have one here, the SYSTRAN extension, and for that maybe I'll look at something like this. I have a web page that's in French. It's one of the news sites that I like a lot. It's Reuters. They have an English version, and then of course a bunch of different languages. Here's the French version. And one thing you can do is if you this is perhaps for intranet, if you control installations on your browsers for your employees' computers, if your IT can deploy this extra extension, what that allows you to do is to say, well, okay, I have something in French or maybe even auto-detect. But with French, you get some extra choices of what profile to use. And what you want to do is simply translate that. You can even have it in automatic translation. So, and you can have it give you some feedback. You can have some tooltips also. I think these are disabled right now. So if I go into here and set the extension settings, I can say, let's show some tooltips as well. And so that way you actually have the ability to see it again in the other language. Where was I here before? Reuters, there. So now it's in English, right? This is the French website, but it's being translated and displayed in English. And if I click on one of the sites, it does the same thing. Initially, you see it in French. Maybe there's some text here in French, and you see it gradually translate. Right? So it's not waiting for the whole page to be translated before it shows it to you, which is nice, especially if you have very long text and you don't want to wait for everything to be translated before you start reading it in English. There's a couple of other ways to use this too, by the way. If instead of translating the whole page, you might want to first, instead of enabling the auto translate, you might want to see the original and simply select it, and from the toolbar right here, say a translate selection. And so that can give you a couple of things like some terminology meaning, the translation of the sentence. Here it is. And so there's some use cases for that too, right? You have a little bit more granularity. And of course we have other tools like keyboard shortcuts. You could simply do a selection and then hit the keyboard shortcut to have that translated and so on. Those are particularly useful for intranet, right? When you control actually what's going on your computers, on your employees' computers. There's another way too, and that's when you have your SPNS. Oops, I went a little bit too fast to that. When you have your SPNS, SYSTRAN Pure Neural Server, there is a console interface. And in fact, we have that in a couple of other places too. And that console interface allows you to go to text translation. You see it, file translation, speech, and that's an optional module. But there's a web translation option here too. So you could say, for instance, if I have something in English, let's go back to the original Reuters.com, and you actually are in France and you're French and you want to see it in French. Right? So that's another way to do that. And it's similar code, but it requires that you log in. So again, that's something that could be quite useful in a case where you are going from, you're behind your firewall or you're on premise and you have the ability to actually control that. So the site was initially in English, and now you're able to read it in your target, in your preferred language. So it's very similar in a way in terms of the end result. No, but it's a slightly different implementation, but very similar to what you can also do with the JavaScript widget. I just wanted to show some of these capabilities. Ultimately, there's also still not to be neglected the DIY, right? Do it yourself. If we have REST API, you can implement this, and that might be particularly useful for an add-on, even with the JavaScript widget perhaps doing the brunt or the bulk of the translation. You could have some extra JavaScript written to code maybe a communication with the server for certain things, like a feedback mechanism. Right. So you have some capabilities also with the API to do all this yourself or to build on top of what's already there. And now it's time to ask the big question: is it free, as in free beer? Well, not exactly. Some of it is, some of it is not. But let's ask Victor and see if there are any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Phil. At this time, we're going to open up the presentation to respond to questions. If your question is very specific or requires more time than we can allow for today, we will make sure and respond directly to assure you receive a full and complete answer. The first question here, Philip, we have is this a proxy server solution?
Good question. No, it's not. So I guess that's probably in comparison to an older product we had, which was called SYSTRAN Links. No, this is not a proxy server solution. So it's really just coming from the browser, meaning the visitor to the website has this JavaScript code that's loaded with the web page, and that code then communicates with the SYSTRAN translation server, and it doesn't go through any proxy. Now, the server itself, if it's on premise on your firewall, you might have some proxy set up there, but as such, in terms of the solution itself for the JavaScript, it's not a proxy server that it's going through.
And second question is coming in here, says, what's the speed of the system? And how are translations for medical terminology?
Right, that's a good question. Both of them, actually. Medical terminology is something that we train engines for in general, right? We have some that are what we call generic engines, but we train them also on specific content so that terminology is recognized better. Even acronyms like POS, point of sale, part of speech, well, it could be pulmonary ovary syndrome. There's even another one, polycystic ovary syndrome. There's a couple of different terms, a lot of hundreds of terms, thousands of terms, acronyms and expressions, multi-word terms, expressions and phrases that we train the engines on, either de facto, we do that for a variety of domains for some languages. And then we also do that specifically for customers. So we can make it really great for you, meaning you, the customer. If you have collections of thousands of sentences that got translated through the years that you collected, maybe from human translators that you hired or inside co-workers and so on, you have material that we can specialize the engine on. So it can be very good. Or it can be superhuman. We have seen cases where, well, it's not just a translation, it's even a subject matter expertise that's showing through that. Now, the speed, that depends a lot on the configuration. I would say the starting speed of a single engine of, let's say, English to Spanish, you would see probably about 2,000 characters per second on a typical current generation or last year's generation Xeon. I see something like 1,400 characters on a 6th generation an i7 with just 8 logical cores. That's really low end, and it's giving you some great results already. The high end, though, it's pretty much unlimited because it's highly scalable. So the speed, and plus it's cached. On top of that, we use a Redis cache. So sentences that you see all over the page again and again, they don't go through translation. They come from the cache. And so we see easily 20,000 characters per second throughput without making that much more effort. But you can do the effort in having multiple instances. I was just talking about a single instance of that language from English to Spanish. Some of them are a little bit faster. I tested the other day on an AWS hosted system. It was 3,400. So it keeps going up, right? The 2,000 characters we measured about 2 years ago, it's way up there beyond that now. Some languages are a little bit slower, but it is easily possible to get in. Let's see, for e-discovery, if you have massive amounts of material you want to translate, talking like thousands and thousands of documents a day, it is possible to scale the server to do that with multiple servers behind it, what we call computing nodes. So it's not all sitting on a single computer server. It's actually multiple assisting systems as well.
Thank you, Phil. We have a question here in regards to the resources or the typical staff needed to maintain the target language. Did you help with that one, Phil?
Yeah, so the staff needing like in-house, well, that depends on what solutions you're going to grab. But if you're going with us in terms of a hosted solution that's in the cloud, there's not a whole lot that you need. You already have your webmaster designing the website, and they're not going to do a whole lot other than adding a line of code in the footer or near the end of the page that says, here's the JavaScript widget from SYSTRAN, load that as well. And the server itself that does the translation is managed by us in that case, if it's in the cloud. Now, if you're looking at having a hosted solution that you hold on premise because you want to use it perhaps for many other things than not just the translation of a website, and it may be intranet as well as some internet external sites, what you need is somebody who knows Linux. It is hosted on CentOS or Red Hat Enterprise Linux, typically 7.8 these days. And so you need somebody who knows Linux. usually that's about it. And then you have some linguists, perhaps, like if you have this other question prior to, how does it do with quality of translation based on special terminology, whether it's automotive repair or medical or patent law and things like these. There are experts that are perhaps linguists that you might have, but you probably have them already. You have, your field, your domain, this is your business, so you know already what you're talking about. Maybe not in all of the other languages, but if you've ever done any sort of language service provider interactions to have material translated for marketing brochures, for technical documentation, you already have quite a bit of material that can be actually loaded into the system, whether it's a list of terminologies or a list of things not to translate, like do not translate list, very commonly seen in most organizations, and especially their patented material, their trademarks, a lot of content, people's names, geographic locations, a lot of things shouldn't translate, and most of the time they don't, because either we were training the engines already for those, or we don't recognize it and we leave it alone. But there are occasionally where it looks like very similar to something that means something else, and so you might see it translated and you want to prevent it. So yeah, that's about it. One or two persons, I would say, possibly just one to be the assigned system administrator. And then perhaps a team of linguists, if there is indeed multiple languages, to customize, right?
Excellent. Thank you, Phil. I know it's difficult to sometimes give a straight answer with some of these questions because it is going to be based on or dependent on the configuration and that which you are setting your system up to particularly respond to.
Yep.
So we've got our next question here, Phil, is actually, I'm going to put two of them together. They're asking if, Pete, I'm going to call you out on it. If you own SPNS, is this free, as in free beer? I love the free beer part. So Pete, if you don't mind, Phil, I'm going to jump in on this one because the next question that's piggybacking this one is going to be, what is the cost of the service? So first, I can just jump in real quick and saying, if depending on the service that you are being supported with, this is a function or a feature that you may have available. If you have an existing solution installed, it is likely that you do have the capability, but what I would recommend and ask that you do is reach out to us, let us know what what your question is specifically on it, so that we can go ahead and provide you with the answer for your specific solution, as well as ask you some questions about what you want to do, what you're looking to do, and how much assistance you may need. While the integration itself or the capability may be available for your existing solution, if you do require any additional support for it or anything else, we would like to discuss what that may be involving. And then in regards to the cost of the service, again, as I stated prior to the question, it's going to be dependent on what all you're looking for. So if you do have minimal translations, but you need the widget, the cost of that would be different as opposed to a subscription level where you're using a solution already, a translation solution at a larger scale and want to incorporate the widget itself. So the best way to get the cost question answered is to set some time up with us so that we can understand exactly all that you would like to see and all that you need done, and provide you a proper quote and scaled quote for that solution moving forward. With that one, did you have anything you wanted to add to that one, Phil?
Yeah, no, I think that's really a good way to describe it. It's open-ended. It could be, it could be zero. There are some, like the JavaScript widget itself can be something that we customize for you at no cost, but you need the server, you need the service, right? In terms of the translation side, and that one indeed, as you mentioned, could be a subscription on a monthly or annual basis, or it could be a server that you host yourself, and then or we host it in AWS or some data center or some other places. So there's many different scenarios, and the cost can be very different from one to another. It depends also on how much volume you're going to want to pump through that translation server, right? Because if it's a intranet for an organization with 500 employees that are internally going to look at maybe a knowledge base, the traffic to that translation server will be very different from a large multinational that has 50,000, 100,000 users all around the world with massive amounts of material that is constantly being consulted by the employees around the globe. globe. So the size of the server and therefore the cost to set it up and to host it or to have it on your own can be very different.
Thank you for that additional info, Phil. Next question is coming in regarding the file translations, and your solution can keep which formats? So which types of files can be translated?
Okay, that's a fair question. Not all files that we can imagine, but many. Certainly plain text files, XML files, XLIF, applications like Word, PowerPoint, Excel, the newer formats, .xlsx, the Word document also, doc or docx, and then open text formats. There's quite a number of formats. There's probably about 20, 25, maybe 30 formats, plus some variants. PDF is another one, and it can be different types of content, a scanned image in a PDF or actually editable text, selectable. In fact, we have a webinar next week on PDF. There is a lot of challenges in some cases, and it's really straightforward in others. And it's not only about what format, but also how quickly can you submit them, right? For instance, if you're translating a website yourself, if you want to create a parallel database and say, well, I have my English database, now I want the French version, how do I translate those hundreds or thousands of documents that are in the English? Maybe it's XML format, maybe it's HTML or plain text, and you have a structure, but you need to translate these files, export them. How do you massively translate these files? There's a couple of solutions. One of them is you could put them into a zip archive and send that entire zip archive to the translation server, and it will digest it and give you back a zip that contains all of the files translated. Another way to do that is with what we call the quick file translator. It's one of the tools in the application pack that's an option to install on your Windows desktop. And the quick file translator, you could simply right-click a folder and say, here, go translate it. And it goes through that, including subfolders and every file that it sees in there. And again, there could be easily 20, 25 different file formats that it can translate. Now, sometimes you need extra formats like InDesign, or maybe you have a Photoshop document with some text in there, or Illustrator, or some other formats that we don't actually have a toolbar for, or the file formats directly supported. But there are some other tools for that. CAT tools, they have maybe some additional import capabilities, and you can configure them to talk to SYSTRAN for the actual translation. So you use them for the filtering of the format in some cases. And then we have a few others, like for instance, with emails, we have a toolbar inside of Outlook. So you can, as you read your email, you can have it translated, or as you write one, you can have it translated. But you can also have the situation where you have a file in MSG format, the message format, or from the Mac, you have an EML format. So we have some parsers that run outside of the server with a tool called the SBox, the SYSTRAN box, that will essentially be something like a drop mechanism, a shared folder. You drop the files in and they come out translated. So there's a lot of ways to work it. It's not only just one single way to do it. The server has the ability to translate many formats, but check with us. We can give you a screenshot of that to give you the full list if you're interested.
Excellent. Thank you, Phil. Next, we have a couple of questions that are surrounding the use of the API key. They're asking about its exposure as well as how it can be protected. Yep. Looking at forging or anything else with it.
Yeah, very valid question, because it is, it's in the JavaScript, it's in the browser. Technically speaking, you cannot completely prevent it from being seen, right? Even if we had, let's say, some encryption, or we send it into a variable, you don't actually see the key, but it's in a variable, it's loaded in a variable, and it communicates. Maybe the script would communicate with the server first, the web server, to say, well, what's the API key? So there's a couple of ways by which you can make it perhaps more difficult to really be seen, but still, technically speaking, you could potentially see it. But at some point it becomes irrelevant. First of all, we have a mechanism called the referrer, so that the browser says, oh, I'm not allowed to use it because it's timed out and it's not coming from this website. So there's a couple of mechanisms like these. There's also, what languages can you have? You can configure it in such a way that the API key comes from an account on that server, but you configure it so that account only does that one language that you're interested in. So nobody else can really use that API key to translate other languages. It would be tied to just that one account's language. And then for another website, you could have a different account, different API key, and so on. So yeah, it's not completely, it's not the same thing as a proxy server, or where you actually have it, the translation go behind the scene, behind the server. But there are there are only very few incentives to get to it, and in the end, you can't use it in a way that really makes sense. The effort is not justifiable anymore. So there will be a few for academic reasons that they boast the fact that they found it. We don't actually hide it, like in OpenNMT.net. It's it's quite possible to see it, but we do a couple of things to make it useless or difficult to really abuse it, and another one that you could do is simply say, well, if the traffic, normally your website, maybe you have 1,000 views, but you see 1 million translation requests, and you say, well, okay, let's change the API key. So you could do that on a daily basis or monthly or quarterly, whenever you see the need for it. So there's a lot of reasons why, even though it's exposed, potentially visible, and only some experts may be figuring out how to actually do that or how to use it, even though that's still the case, it's not necessarily something that we have to worry about.
And do we offer this for corporations or individuals as well?
No, so this is typically for companies, for corporations that have a website. Now, if you are, let's say, if you have a website, yeah, you could potentially say, well, I have my website, and it's typically, you're going to need a translation service of some sort to tie it with. Right, so that's usually a company, but there could be a wealthy individual. We want to talk to you, but there is, you need a website that you control and that in which you can put the JavaScript widget. You need to host the JavaScript widget there too, and then you need a translation server, and that will be, and one perhaps the best. The question sometimes comes up is, okay, we can see using this in some cases for internet, but between internet and intranet, where is it really the best use case? I'd say the intranet. Now, you take a big multinational that has tens of thousands of employees around the world, and they have websites in many different languages, but they're all intranet. They're internal. You can only see them through their VPN if you're outside, or you cannot see them at all unless you log in on premise. So that kind of scenario is really where it's a good solution. It's the best solution. It's very fast to deploy. And it may, at the end of the day, not be the only way you stick with it, right? You may actually say later, you know what, we still need to do a few things, like change the image. Let's say a travel website, you might say, hey, let's show the picture of Paris, Eiffel Tower. Let's go to Rome. A different picture there with the Colosseum. So you want to not change just the text in terms of translating it, but you may want to control what images are shown or some other content, multimedia at different types, audio, and so that sort of thing is something you better control at the application level. So just because we have a JavaScript widget you might use initially for a quick deployment, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to stick with just that. You just may need some time to fully develop your own version with a translated parallel database as well. And for that, our quick file translator and other tools can come in really handy as well.
And we have another one here about the translation server. How scalable is it? Could we start, for example, with a single SPNS server with multiple languages, single languages, and add more as we need?
Yes, absolutely. That's a good question. It's, because especially if you don't know the technology yet, if you haven't worked with us, SYSTRAN, or with machine translation at large, but particularly with neural machine translation, it's natural that you may have some reservations. So initially you might say, well, we have a budget, we have a project, we need it for at least this website or for this particular project, and maybe just for 2 or 3 languages at first. So you could start with a server that's relatively low end. It could be a virtual machine, right, like a VMware or something like that. And then gradually increase it. But you might scale it in 2 ways. One is, let's say you have a system with enough memory, let's say 128 gigs of RAM, and enough CPU cores, let's say 32 or 64 CPU cores, to actually load another dozen of languages on there, maybe 20 even. And so you can do that, and basically that's a vertical scale, especially if you have the hardware or the VM and the control to say, you know what, initially we started with 16 cores, let's give it 32, and basically keep adding before you exhaust that. But you have the horizontal scalability too. The translations are coming from what we call a computing node. A compute node, there is at least one on that one box. If you have just one box, the one server will include a computing node, and on there is where your translation engines sit. So you have Spanish to English, Japanese to English, English to German, etc. Each of those on the computing node. Now, what's possible is you can actually have another computing node, not the full server, right? Not the full license for the full server, just another computing node. It comes at a premium, but it's a one license to say, okay, I want to have that computing node option. And then you can have as many computing nodes. You can scale it horizontally as you want. So we have some big banks or insurance companies that translate massive amounts of material, and they take one server at the front end plus 20 different computing nodes, maybe for 2 or 3 languages at a time with some overlap for redundancy. And so that is highly scalable, which means that instead of doing just one instance of a language engine, of a translator, you could have 5, 6 of them and get it easily 5, 6 times faster, plus the caching. It's scalable in many different ways. Plus, you can have actually additional servers with maybe a load balancer in front of it so that it routes it through different ways. And in fact, the JavaScript widget does that to some extent. When it's analyzing which sentences do need translation, right? It's not just sending the whole page as we saw in the slides early. It actually analyzes it and decides what to send in for translation. At that point, it has identified, let's say, for instance, 100 sentences that are in English that we need to translate to French. And what it does is it sends it in little packets, like 5 or 10 sentences at a time. And so it does a parallelism there. Now, they're all going to the same server, but inside the server, it will package it and send it to potentially different computing nodes, and it gets parallelized and goes faster that way too. So I would say, the short answer is like it's very scalable. There's a lot of different ways to make this thing fly really fast. And we use it in e-discovery. If you're familiar with something like Relativity or other e-discovery tools, it's a good place to get massive amounts of translations with what they call mass action going really fast.
Thank you, Phil. I know we've got a couple other questions that are coming in here that may require a little bit of a longer, more specific response. So I'm going to have to ask that you please feel free to send me those questions directly so that we could provide an appropriate response and not make assumptions in responding. So thank you for your questions. Please keep in mind, you can revolutionize your global presence by increasing productivity, driving multilingual collaboration, and reducing costs, all while reaching a global audience fast and easy. Don't make the mistake of assuming your message is understood. Take this opportunity to really, by setting some time for us to discuss your specific use cases, the time has never been better for us to connect. So unfortunately, we have run out of time today, but we will assure and respond to your individual questions. This will conclude our presentation, a simple solution to globalize your website. On behalf of our entire team at SYSTRAN, thank you for joining us. We look forward to connecting and discussing your opportunity. Send me a message and schedule some time today. Thank you, everybody. We look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.